Welcome to the second in a series of 5 Rehabilitation Services Administration Technical Assistance Programs on prior approval. My name is Terry Martin, Technical Assistance Specialist in the Rehabilitation Services Administration State Monitoring and Improvement Division, Technical Assistance Unit. The presenters for our program are David Steele, Chief of RSA State Monitoring Improvement Division Fiscal Unit, and Julia Doyle, Fiscal Unit Financial Management Specialist. This technical assistance program will provide information about when grantees are required to submit requests for prior approval. David?
Thanks, Terry. This webinar is applicable to all the Rehabilitation Service Administration's Formula Grant Awards. And as Terry mentioned, the presentation will cover select items where prior approval is required and reviews how to submit prior approval requests. So let's start with when is prior approval required? This is just a list as we talked about, as I just mentioned. We're just covering some select items and the list is exhaustive. The uniform guidance at 200.407 lists a variety of areas in which prior approval is required and should always be a grantee's reference in looking for what is required with regard to the uniform guidance. And these are some of the areas that are mentioned in that list in the uniform guidance. For example, real property and related capital expenditures, and this includes for state vocational rehabilitation programs, the establishment authority. So prior approval is required when for direct charge of capital expenditures for general purpose equipment, buildings, and land, for direct charge of capital expenditures for improvements to land and buildings, which materially increase their value or useful life, and for special arrangements and alteration costs incurred. Capital expenditures are defined at 2 CFR 200.13 as expenditures to acquire capital assets or expenditures to make additions, improvements, modifications, replacements, rearrangements, reinstallations, renovations, or alterations to capital assets that materially increase the value or useful life. That list is fairly long and encompasses a variety of activities, including, as it says, improvements, modifications, rearrangements, replacements, reinstallations. If you have questions about what fits into that, I would encourage you to request prior approval, just to be certain. It includes, as it said, lands, buildings, and equipment, so renovations or alterations to lands, buildings, or equipment is included in that definition. To the extent an agency wishes to charge such costs directly to its federal award, prior approval is required. With regard to rearrangement and reconversion costs, at 2 CFR 200.462A, costs incurred for ordinary and normal rearrangement and alteration of facilities are allowable as indirect costs. Let me state that one more time. Costs incurred for ordinary and normal rearrangement and alteration of facilities are allowable as indirect costs. Special arrangements and alteration costs incurred specifically for a federal award are allowable as direct costs with prior approval. Therefore, the costs associated with ordinary and normal rearrangement and alteration of facilities, for example, you want to rearrange the office space where staff are working. Typically, those costs should be paid using an indirect cost methodology. For special arrangements or alterations, costs to be charged directly to a federal award, prior approval is required. And as mentioned in an earlier session, in session 1, if a cost is already designed is already included in your indirect cost rate or cost allocation plan, and the methodology has been approved by the federal cognizant agency as the methodology to use in charging the cost, prior approval isn't a way to circumvent that. So if it states in your indirect cost rate plan that costs such as alterations will be included as indirect costs or charged as indirect costs, then it would be expected that the grantee would charge those as indirect costs and not request prior approval. So again, when prior approval is required, it's for costs associated, special arrangements and alterations incurred specifically for a federal award for which prior approval is required. Equipment and related capital expenditures. Prior approval is required to encumber equipment purchased with federal funds. There are 2 places in the uniform guidance where you're required to have prior approval before actually incurring or encumbering the costs and prior to the costs. And one of those is participant support costs, and one of those is equipment. So it means that you're not necessarily obligating the equipment and then requesting permission from RSA to get prior approval for it. It means that prior to encumbering or obligating the equipment purchase or item purchase, prior approval is required. Prior approval is also required to direct charge capital expenditures for general purpose equipment, buildings, and land. Direct charge capital expenditures for special purpose equipment over $5,000. RSA-TAC 1802 was issued, and it provides a streamlined prior approval request for certain general purpose equipment for the State Vocational Rehabilitation Services Program. And again, that TAC is Technical Assistance Circular is specific to the State Vocational Rehabilitation Services Program and is not applicable to the SE awards or to, for example, the independent living services for older individuals who are blind. Additionally, it's important to remember that with regard to the capital expenditures over $5,000, that we also look there at the state threshold, which you'll be hearing more about throughout the presentations.
Thank you, David. It may be helpful to talk a little bit more about equipment.
Thanks, Terry. Under 2 CFR 200, grantees must obtain RSA's prior approval before purchasing and incurring obligations for equipment. In determining whether prior approval is required for any kind of equipment, obligations, or purchases, it's first important for grantees to determine whether the item meets the definition of equipment or whether it's a supply. Equipment requires prior approval. Supplies do not require prior approval. And in determining what is considered equipment, agencies must consider the equipment capitalization threshold. So if, for example, if a state has a capitalization threshold, for purposes of determining whether the tangible personal property meets the definition of equipment at 2 CFR 200.33, and thus requires prior approval, a grantee must make this determination on the basis of the state's capitalization threshold level or the Uniform Guidance capitalization threshold level of $5,000, whichever is lower. For example, if a state designates purchases at or above $1,000 of equipment, the grantee must use the state's threshold, $1,000, in determining when a purchase meets the definition of equipment under the Uniform Guidance and thus requires prior approval. For a more detailed example, let's say one state wants to purchase 20 laptops at $1,000 each to replace older equipment. The state's threshold for capitalization is the same as the federal threshold, $5,000. Therefore, because the cost of each laptop is below the state and federal threshold, prior approval wouldn't be required. That would be treated as a supply. However, if the state had an equipment, a VR program in another state wanted to purchase 20 laptops at $1,000 each, the same as the agency just mentioned. However, the state's equipment capitalization threshold was $500. In this instance, the agency would have to obtain prior approval from RSA in order to purchase the laptops because the purchase amount exceeds the state's equipment capitalization threshold. I also wanted to mention that many states, there's a difference between when they consider tagging or tracking equipment and when it's determined to be an equipment by the capitalization threshold. For example, a state may have a capitalization threshold that's $3,000. Anything above that is considered equipment. But they actually begin tracking laptops and stuff at a level of $1,000. The threshold we're looking for here is the one at which the state says, after this, it's determined to be equipment, the capitalization threshold, not the level at which an agency monitors equipment or tracks it. We certainly understand that we want to keep track of the laptops that were purchased and inventory those types of things. So it's not really an inventory measure as much as when the state defines the item to technically be equipment for the state's purposes. Participant support costs also require approval. Participant support costs paid to or on behalf of participants or trainees, but not employees. So it's important to remember that we're not talking about these costs in relationship to staff or employees. Participant support costs means direct costs for items such as stipends or subsistence allowances, travel allowances, and registration fees paid to or on behalf of participants or trainees, but not employees in connections with conferences or training projects. RSA's Technical Assistance Circular 1802 also provided some flexibility for state VR agencies in submitting streamlined prior approval requests for participant support costs. And I would encourage VR agencies to review that TAC and the flexibilities that are provided. And also note that there's additional information included in Session 5, prior approval participant support costs specific to the State Vocational Rehabilitation Services Program. So please review that as well. With regard to the participant support costs, one of the things that people have asked is when it talks about costs and stipends as assistance and in connection with conferences, what is a conference? And the Uniform Guidance defines a conference as a meeting, retreat, seminar, symposium, workshop, or event whose primary purpose is disseminating technical information beyond the non-federal entity and is reasonable for the successful performance of the award. Important things to remember here is that, again, the prior approval is related to people who are not agency employees. And also, when looking at the purpose of whether it requires prior approval, is it for the dissemination of technical information beyond the non-federal entity? And is it required for successful performance of the award? Some miscellaneous items that we wanted to call your attention to with regard to prior approval. Costs such as incorporation fees, broker fees, fees to promoters, organizers, or management consultants, attorneys, accountants, or investment counselors, whether or not employees of the non-federal entity in connection with establishment or reorganization. So if you're looking at an agency reorganizing or reestablishing or a, sort of, in many instances, a broader government function at the state level, and as you can see, if they're involved in those activities, or you have attorneys who are involved or management consultants, whether or not employees of the non-federal entity, so whether or not they are employed, so if they're employees and they're conducting these activities, you still have to get prior approval for them. The cost of any civic or community organization membership requires prior approval. Costs incurred for the normal rearrangement and alteration of facilities that a grantee wants to charge directly to an award. So as we mentioned earlier, the costs for ordinary or normal rearrangement and alteration are generally allowable only as indirect costs. If the costs are going to be charged directly to an award, they're going to require prior approval. The use of unrecovered indirect costs, including indirect costs on cost sharing or matching. So if an agency wants to use unrecovered indirect costs for matching purposes under one of the grant awards that requires match, they would need prior approval. The direct charging of salaries of administrative and clerical staff, normally treated as indirect costs. We also have a separate session, prior approval in the series on this specific item, and that's session 3, so please refer to it for additional details. And then the use of indirect costs to pay for abnormal or mass severance pay. These are unallowable as direct costs. There are specific requirements related to normal turnover severance and abnormal or mass severance that agencies should pay particular attention to before committing severance programs or payments. And those requirements are included at 2 CFR 200.431.1. And again, this is a very complex issue with regard to severance payments. And we would encourage you, if you have questions, to contact your financial management specialist so that we can work with you to ensure that the requirements of 2 CFR 200 are met. If a state is looking at either normal severance, abnormal, or mass severance, which are all defined within the Uniform Guidance for reference purposes. Now we'd like to talk a little bit about some advertising or public relations costs that are mentioned in 2 CFR 200.421. Allowable advertising costs are those which are solely for the recruitment of personnel required by the non-federal entity, so certainly putting out job notices or openings, information about those is allowable. procurement of goods and services for the performance of a federal award, bids, solicitation for bids, proposals, the disposal of scrap or surplus material acquired in the performance of a federal award. So if you're actually disposing of, through a bid process, of equipment that was purchased or other capital items, capital assets, program outreach and other specific purposes necessary to meet the requirements of the federal award. We received a significant number of questions from grantees regarding advertising and public relations costs.
So what are agencies allowed to pay for?
The only allowable public relations costs are those costs specifically required by the federal award, the costs of communicating with the public and press pertaining to specific activities or accomplishment which result from performance of the federal award. These costs are considered necessary. And the cost of conducting limited general liaison responsibility with news, media, and government public relations. So you can see this is limited to the public relations costs are only those that are required under the federal award. And again, that word is required. The cost of communicating with the public and press pertaining to specific activities or accomplishments. And the costs of conducting limited general liaison responsibilities with news and media organizations. So some unallowable advertising and public relations costs. All advertising and public relations costs except those specifically allowed in 2 CFR 200-42 are allowable, including the cost of meetings, conventions, convocations, and other events related to other activities of the entity. The important thing to point out here are the other activities of the entity. So if a grantee if it's not directly involved with the award and it was another activity of the entity, the costs listed under there would not be allowable. Additionally, the cost of promotional items and memorabilia, including models, gifts, souvenirs, and the cost of advertising and public relations designed solely to promote the non-federal entity. And this is an important consideration, for example, if you're looking at things like brochures or other information going out that benefits the agency as a whole, it's important to understand that the cost of advertising and public relations, the cost of that can't be borne to the federal award. In other words, you can't promote the entity. What you're promoting using federal funds is the program or the grant award and the program that it's funding, but not necessarily the entity as a whole. In and of itself. So what's left? Public outreach and program outreach is certainly something that's allowable underneath federal grant awards. But public and program outreach is limited to the provision of information about the program on the provision of factual information, such as the services it provides and the individuals it serves. For example, providing brochures, pamphlets, and general program information to potential consumers. And as a reminder, those costs need to be allocated. If a grantee is printing information about its program that includes references to various activities funded by different sources, the cost must be allocated to all benefiting programs. If the grantee has a display booth, etc., at a conference that provides information about various activities funded by different sources, the cost must be allocated to benefiting programs. And again, it's important to note that such activities, when done on behalf of an agency that serves multiple grant awards, needs to ensure that those costs are adequately allocated to those grant awards, and the cost of brochures and other items are adequately cost allocated as well. Unallowable promotional items. The 2 CFR 200-421 makes clear that the costs of promotional items are not allowable. Promotional items include pens, notepads, cups, and other items with the grantee's logo stamped on them the grantee uses to distribute to the public or a business as a means of doing community outreach or ensuring good community relations. As such, the cost to produce these promotional items are not allowable and therefore may not be paid with grant funds, non-federal funds for match purposes, or program income. It's important to note that grantees may still use non-federal funds for promotional items. However, such expenses may not be counted as match for grants that have a matching requirement. If the grantee needs to market its services in a manner that is not specifically prohibited, costs incurred in the purchase or manufacture of promotional items, it may incur those marketing costs necessary for the performance of activities under the grant after obtaining prior approval from RSA. In short, if a grantee believes it needs to market its services in a manner that is not specifically prohibited, then in the uniform guidance, then the grantee should submit a prior approval request to RSA requesting approval to charge those to award. So again, if you believe that there's a need to market its services in a manner that is not specifically prohibited in the uniform guidance, the grantee must first request prior approval. We understand that there might be circumstances which we haven't thought of that may come into play with regard to public relations and advertising costs, and if so, we're providing the agency the options or the alternative to submit prior approval requests so that we can review those and determine their allowability. The important thing here is that if they're strictly prohibited under the uniform guidance, getting prior approval won't allow us to circumvent that requirement. It's still prohibited cost underneath the uniform guidance, and we don't have the authority to waive that requirement. Okay. So as a reminder, too, with regard to just public relations in general and information being shared with the public, as a reminder, a term and condition of RSA's formula grant awards includes something called the Stevens Amendment, which states that when issuing statements, press releases, requests for proposals, bid solicitation, and other documents describing projects or programs funded in whole or in part with federal money, all grantees receiving federal funds, including but not limited to state and local governments, shall clearly state the percentage of the total cost of the program or the project which will be financed with federal money, the dollar amount of federal funds for the project or program, and the percentage of the dollar amount of the total cost of the project or program that will be financed by non-governmental sources. This language is part of the grant award, and it's important for grantees to ensure compliance with this requirement when developing brochures, issuing statements, press releases, requests for proposals, and bid solicitations. One of the questions we did get about this was, does this mean that we have to include this information with every email and every correspondence? And that's simply not the case. If you look at the requirement, it says for issuing statements or press releases, requests for proposals, or in other documents describing projects and programs funded. So we're talking here about the more general statements. When you're putting out something related to this is the VR program, this is information about what the VR program is, or when you're doing it with related to a CAP program or a PAIR program, that information, this is then required to be included with that information describing the program or project. And also, as it says, a request for proposals or bid solicitations, it also has to be included in those requirements. So how to submit prior approval requests? For information regarding how to submit prior approval requests, please see the first presentation in the series, Prior Approval Overview. The detailed presentation regarding a specific prior approval category, or if not specifically addressed for a particular item requiring prior approval, please consult the financial management specialist assigned to your state. And again, more information is available in the Session 1, Prior Approval Overview.
Thank you, David. Should you have additional questions related to the content of this technical assistance program on prior approval or any of the other programs related to our technical assistance program on prior approval, we ask that you direct those email questions to rsafiscal@ed.gov. If you have questions specific to your agency or a specific question related to a concern you have on prior approval, please submit that to your State Fiscal Liaison. Thank you so much, and thank you for joining us for this program, and we invite you to review all the programs in this RSA Technical Assistance Series on prior approval. Thank you very much.